Have you ever noticed that the biggest intelligence stories rarely begin with spies? They begin with job offers. Not stolen blueprints, not midnight break-ins, not dramatic chases through crowded train stations. Just a recruiter, a friendly email, a conference invitation, or a consulting contract that seems too generous to refuse. That's exactly why Japan's latest discovery has triggered alarm inside Tokyo. According to multiple Japanese investigations, authorities spent years quietly tracking an unusual pattern. Engineers from some of Japan's most strategically important industries kept leaving. Some retired, some accepted consulting positions. Others claimed they were simply pursuing better opportunities overseas. Individually, none of these departures looked suspicious. Collectively, they formed something much bigger. Now, investigators reportedly believe they have reconstructed years of recruitment activity targeting Japanese technical talent, revealing a network that stretched across multiple industries and involved far more people than initially suspected. And here's the uncomfortable question. Was this simply global competition for skilled workers? Or was it something much more organized? Because once you stop looking at these cases as isolated career moves, the picture changes completely. This story isn't really about espionage in the Hollywood sense. It's about knowledge. The most valuable asset in the modern economy isn't oil. It isn't gold. It isn't even semiconductor factories. It's the people who know how those factories actually work. Think about it. Anyone can buy machinery if suppliers are willing to sell. Anyone can construct buildings. Anyone can hire thousands of workers. But decades of manufacturing experience? The tiny adjustments that improve chip yields, the production tricks that never appear in technical manuals, the mistakes that engineers learn only after 20 years inside a factory, those things cannot simply be downloaded. They're carried inside people's heads. And that makes experienced engineers one of the world's most valuable strategic resources. China understood this years ago, especially after export controls began limiting access to advanced technology. If machines become harder to acquire, then perhaps the faster route is acquiring experience instead. Not by stealing documents, by hiring the people who already possess the knowledge. It's a strategy that sounds almost obvious once someone says it aloud. Why spend 10 years rediscovering manufacturing techniques if you can recruit the people who developed them in the first place? Governments call it technology transfer. Companies call it recruitment. Intelligence agencies sometimes call it something else entirely. That difference in vocabulary matters because each side sees exactly the same event through a completely different lens. A company sees higher salaries. An engineer sees a better opportunity. A government sees strategic capability moving across borders. Who's actually right? Possibly all of them. Japan's concern isn't simply that talented people accepted overseas jobs. Engineers change employers all the time. That's normal. The concern is whether individual recruitment efforts collectively accelerated the transfer of critical industrial expertise that took Japan decades to develop. That's a very different conversation. Especially when the industries involved include semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, robotics, precision equipment, specialty materials, and next-generation electronics. Notice something interesting. These aren't random sectors. They're exactly the industries that increasingly define geopolitical power. Military strength increasingly depends on commercial technology. Economic influence depends on manufacturing leadership. Artificial intelligence depends on advanced chips. Electric vehicles depend on battery innovation. Everything is becoming connected, which means engineers have quietly become strategic assets. Not soldiers, not politicians, engineers. Here's my opinion. Most governments still think they are competing for factories. I think they're actually competing for brains. Factories can be replicated. Knowledge takes generations. And that's why talent has become one of the most contested resources on Earth. But another question keeps bothering me. If every major country starts treating experienced engineers as strategic national assets, where does individual freedom fit into that equation? Can governments realistically tell people where they may or may not work? That's a debate democracies are going to face more often in the coming years. Because this isn't just Japan's problem, it's becoming everyone's problem. And the timing couldn't be more significant. The global technology race is accelerating. The competition over artificial intelligence, semiconductor manufacturing, advanced materials, and defense technology isn't slowing down. It's intensifying. Which means the battle for talent is probably only beginning. The real surprise may not be that Japan uncovered years of recruitment activity. The real surprise is that similar stories are likely unfolding quietly in several countries at exactly the same time. Most of them simply haven't found the full list yet. Imagine you're trying to build the world's most advanced semiconductor industry. You have billions of dollars, you have government support, you have enormous factories rising from empty fields almost overnight, but you're still missing one critical ingredient: experience. And experience doesn't come in shipping containers, it arrives on airplanes. That's where this story becomes far more complicated than a simple recruitment campaign. Because once Japanese investigators reportedly began connecting names, timelines, and companies, another pattern started emerging. Many of the individuals being recruited weren't ordinary employees. They were veterans, people who had spent decades solving manufacturing problems that younger engineers had never even encountered. Think about semiconductor production for a moment. Building a chip isn't like baking a cake from a recipe. Two factories can own identical equipment, use identical materials, follow identical manufacturing steps, yet produce dramatically different yields. Why? Because countless tiny decisions happen every single day inside a fabrication plant. Pressure adjustments, temperature corrections, chemical timing, machine calibration, none of these are glamorous. Yet together, they determine whether a company earns billions or throws away billions in defective chips. That invisible layer of expertise is what companies spend decades developing. And once an experienced engineer retires, they don't suddenly forget everything they learned. Their knowledge remains remarkably valuable. That's why many countries now compete for senior technical talent just as aggressively as they compete for investment capital. China wasn't inventing something entirely new. The United States has long recruited foreign scientists. European firms regularly hire engineers from Asia. Japanese companies recruit globally as well. Talent moves around the world. That's how innovation often spreads. The difference lies in scale and strategic intent. If hundreds of specialists from industries considered nationally important begin moving in similar directions, governments naturally start asking uncomfortable questions. Is this market competition? Or is it industrial strategy operating through private hiring? That line isn't always easy to define. And that's precisely why this issue has become politically explosive. Japan's government has increasingly viewed advanced manufacturing not merely as an economic issue, but as a national security issue. Especially after the global semiconductor shortages revealed just how fragile modern supply chains really are. Suddenly, engineers weren't simply employees anymore, they became part of national resilience. Here's something fascinating that often gets overlooked. Countries rarely lose technological leadership overnight. Instead, they gradually lose the people who know how to solve tomorrow's problems. The buildings remain, the equipment remains, even the patents remain, but the culture of problem-solving slowly shifts elsewhere. History is full of examples. Industrial leadership has moved from Britain to America, from America to parts of East Asia, and now the next transition is being fiercely contested. Every generation believes its technological advantage will last forever. History usually disagrees. One senior industry executive once described manufacturing knowledge in a way I can't stop thinking about. He said documentation teaches you what should happen. Veteran engineers teach you why it sometimes doesn't. That difference is enormous. Because unexpected failures are where real expertise becomes priceless. You can't Google 30 years of troubleshooting experience. You have to live it, or hire someone who already has. Here's my prediction. Within the next decade, countries will compete for experienced engineers almost the way football clubs compete for superstar athletes. Except instead of transfer fees making headlines, governments will quietly rewrite immigration policies. Companies will create extraordinary compensation packages. Universities will become strategic pipelines rather than educational institutions alone. We're already seeing early signs of that shift. And here's my opinion. Many analysts still focus almost entirely on chip factories. I think they're watching the wrong scoreboard. Factories matter, equipment matters, capital matters. But the country that consistently attracts, trains, and retains elite technical talent will probably dominate the industries of the 2030s. The smartest engineers don't simply build products, they build ecosystems. One experienced mentor can train hundreds of younger engineers. One manufacturing expert can improve production across an entire factory. That's an impact no machine can replicate. But one question refuses to disappear. If every major economy is aggressively hunting the same limited pool of world-class technical experts, who eventually runs out first? Money? Factories? Or talent itself? Because unlike steel, silicon, or investment capital, human expertise cannot be mass-produced, and that may turn out to be the single biggest bottleneck in the entire global technology race. The battle unfolding today isn't just about who manufactures the next generation of chips. It's about who inherits the people capable of imagining the generation after that. Everything else may simply follow. Here's the twist that makes this entire story even more unsettling. Suppose every engineer accepted every offer legally. Suppose every contract complied with labor laws. Suppose nobody stole a single classified document. A country could still wake up years later and discover that an enormous amount of strategic know-how had quietly moved somewhere else. No crime, no dramatic espionage, just thousands of perfectly legal career decisions adding up to a geopolitical consequence. That's the uncomfortable reality governments are now trying to understand. Because in the 21st century, influence doesn't always cross borders inside briefcases. Sometimes it crosses inside resumes. Japan isn't responding to this challenge alone. Across Europe, the United States, South Korea, and Taiwan, policymakers have started asking similar questions. How do you protect critical industries without restricting the freedom of skilled professionals? How do you encourage innovation while preventing the gradual erosion of national expertise? There are no easy answers. If governments become too restrictive, they risk driving talent away. If they remain completely open, they may accelerate the transfer of strategically important knowledge. Finding the balance is becoming one of the defining policy challenges of our time. And notice how different this competition looks compared with the Cold War. Back then, countries primarily fought over missiles, military bases, and ideological influence. Today's contest is quieter. Supply chains, semiconductor equipment, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, battery chemistry, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing. The battlefield has shifted from military front lines to industrial ecosystems. That's why this story matters far beyond Japan and China. It's really about how nations compete in an economy where technology determines military strength, economic growth, and geopolitical influence all at once. Consider how quickly governments have changed their language. 10 years ago, politicians mostly talked about globalization. Today, they speak about resilience, strategic autonomy, friendshoring, economic security, trusted supply chains. Those aren't just fashionable buzzwords, they're evidence that governments increasingly see technology as national infrastructure rather than ordinary commerce. Once that mindset changes, every engineer suddenly becomes more important, not because they're carrying secrets, but because they carry experience. And experience is remarkably difficult to replace. Here's something I think many people underestimate. The next industrial revolution won't be won solely by whoever invents the most groundbreaking technology. It will be won by whoever scales that technology fastest. Innovation creates headlines. Manufacturing creates dominance. History keeps proving that lesson over and over again. A brilliant prototype changes headlines for a week. Reliable mass production changes the global economy for decades. That's why experienced manufacturing specialists have become so valuable. They're the people who transform laboratory breakthroughs into millions of products people actually buy. Here's my opinion. Governments spent years worrying about intellectual property. I think they should have spent just as much time worrying about institutional memory. Patents eventually expire, machines become obsolete, buildings age. But a generation of experienced engineers leaving at the same time can create a gap that lasts far longer than any single technology cycle. And here's another question worth asking. What happens when countries begin competing not only to recruit talent, but to prevent talent from leaving? Will employment contracts become stricter? Will governments expand national security reviews? Will certain industries eventually resemble the defense sector, where movement becomes increasingly regulated? Those possibilities no longer sound unrealistic. In fact, we're already seeing early discussions moving in exactly that direction. My prediction is that the next decade will redefine what economic security actually means. It won't just involve protecting ports, power grids, or communication networks. It will increasingly involve protecting ecosystems of knowledge. Countries that recognize this early may gain a lasting advantage. Those that recognize it too late may spend years trying to rebuild expertise that quietly disappeared long before anyone noticed. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson hidden inside Japan's investigation. The real competition between nations isn't always visible. Sometimes it happens one recruiter, one engineer, one job offer, and one resignation letter at a time. By the time governments realize what's happening, the most valuable transfer may already be complete. When historians look back at this period, I don't think they'll describe it as the age of trade wars, or even the age of chip wars. They may call it the age of the global talent war, because underneath every headline about export controls, semiconductor sanctions, or billion-dollar factories lies one simple truth. None of it works without people. You can subsidize factories, you can approve massive industrial policies, you can restrict exports, you can blacklist companies, but none of those actions automatically create engineers with 30 years of manufacturing experience. Time remains the one resource no government can accelerate. That's why Japan's reported investigation should be viewed as something larger than a single national security story. It's a warning, not just for Tokyo, but for every advanced economy that assumes technological leadership is permanent. History has never been kind to countries that become complacent. Look back over the past century. The world's industrial center has shifted multiple times. Nations that once dominated shipbuilding, steel, consumer electronics, or automobiles eventually discovered that yesterday's advantage doesn't guarantee tomorrow's success. Technology leadership is never inherited. It has to be rebuilt by every generation. China appears to understand that lesson well. Instead of relying on a single strategy, it has pursued multiple paths simultaneously, investing heavily in education, expanding domestic research, supporting industrial development, encouraging overseas study, and competing aggressively for experienced technical talent. Whether people agree with every aspect of that approach or not, it's difficult to ignore its scale. And that's where I think many discussions become too simplistic. People often frame this as a battle between East and West. I don't think that's accurate. This is a competition between countries that recognize knowledge as a strategic resource and those that still think physical infrastructure alone guarantees leadership. One mindset is preparing for the industries of 2040. The other is often defending the achievements of 2000. That's a dangerous gap. Here's my opinion. The most valuable national asset today isn't located underground. It's not rare earth minerals, it's not oil reserves, it's not even advanced factories. It's a country's ability to continuously educate, attract, and retain world-class talent. Everything else grows from that foundation. Lose the people, and eventually you lose the industries. Lose the industries, and eventually you lose influence. The sequence is surprisingly consistent. But here's the question I keep coming back to. If every major power is now competing for the same engineers, scientists, AI researchers, and manufacturing specialists, who is investing enough in creating the next generation? Recruitment solves today's shortage. Education solves tomorrow's. Only one of those strategies is sustainable over decades. That's why I believe the countries that win this race won't necessarily be the ones offering the highest salaries. They'll be the ones building environments where talented people actually want to stay, innovate, teach, and mentor others. Money attracts talent, purpose retains it, opportunity multiplies it. That distinction could decide the technological balance of the next 20 years. My prediction is that stories like this won't become rarer, they'll become routine. Governments will launch stricter screening mechanisms, companies will strengthen internal security, universities will become even more important as pipelines for strategic industries. And experienced engineers, once viewed simply as employees, will increasingly be regarded as national assets. Not because they carry secret documents, because they carry decades of accumulated judgment. That's something no artificial intelligence, no matter how powerful, can instantly replicate. And perhaps that's the biggest irony of all. We're entering an era obsessed with automation and AI, yet the world's fiercest competition may still revolve around something profoundly human: experience. So the next time you read about another billion-dollar chip factory, another export restriction, or another geopolitical dispute, ask yourself one simple question: who already knows how to make it work? Because in the end, that answer may matter more than the factory itself. And if Japan's investigation teaches us anything, it's this: the most important strategic resource in the modern world isn't hidden inside a warehouse. It's walking through the front door every morning, carrying a laptop, a lifetime of experience, and knowledge that no blueprint can fully capture.